Welcome to the Nerd Party.
Hi, this is Henry Gilroy, co-executive producer of Star Wars Rebels. You're listening to Aggressive Negotiations.
Welcome to Aggressive Negotiations, coming at you from the bright center of the galaxy here on Coruscant. I'm so excited to be here, and with me, as he is always, just the incredibly talented and just wonderfully gifted Jedi Master, John Mills.
I'm overwhelmed. I thank you so much for such a complimentary introduction, Jedi Master Matthew Rushing. It is, as always, of course, a pleasure to sit here and talk about Star Wars with you. Something I look forward to every week.
Absolutely. I mean, there's just something about sitting down and talking with a friend about the wars. And, you know, I feel like we've mentioned recently, there's just so much stuff that is going to be coming out that has our appetites whetted, you know, as we eagerly anticipate things that are coming out. And
yes.
But there's, you know, at the same time, there's a lot to look back on this year. And we're going to continue with that thought. But before we do that, we would love for you to visit Apple Podcasts or iTunes and give us a star rating and written review. Help people find the show. Look, we say it every week, but we just totally mean it. If you give us a star rating review, it helps people find the show. And it makes a big difference with the search rankings and everything like that. It's been a while since we've had a new review, so please do help the show out that way. Also, you can find us wherever you get podcasts. Legitimately, we are everywhere, so make sure you're checking us out. You know, it doesn't matter if you're an Apple user or an Android user or whatever, just where you get your podcast, subscribe to Aggressive Negotiations. You can find us on Twitter at Join Nerd Party. That's the entire network. And if you want to just catch up with the show, John and I run The Jedi Masters at The Jedi Masters, and that's the show account where we tweet things about Star Wars. We talk to people about Star Wars. We talk to people about the podcast. It is just a place for good Star Wars goodness every single day, so check that out. And follow us. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/thenerdparty, and go to thenerdparty.com where you can see all of the shows that we're doing. I mean, I think we probably have a show for just about every, you know, big genre thing that's out there right now, whether, you know, it's Doctor Who, maybe you've missed things, so you need to go to Missing Frames, or you want to check out Retro's Perspective, or maybe The Married Nerd Life, or, I mean, it's endless, the podcasts that we've got, so make sure you check them out. And then last but not least, John and I would love to get emails from you, so go to thenerdparty.com/contact, choose a show, choose Aggressive Negotiations, and you can talk to us that way. So, John, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we're looking forward to a lot of things, but we're also looking back because, believe it or not, we are that old. The Phantom Menace is 20 years old this year.
20 years old. Kind of stunning.
It is.
Stunning. Where were you in 99?
I was at my first year of being a counselor at camp, and I was at lifeguard training the week that this movie came out. In fact, I did not get to see it opening day because of that. So,
I saw it 12:01 a.m. On opening day, and I was working, and I took a vacation from work. People got sick of hearing me count down to the Phantom Menace, and honestly, it's so wild how much has changed in the last 20 years, and thinking back on it is a pleasure, actually. It really is a pleasant nostalgia to remember the anticipation, because if we're lining up, you know, this is coming out in January, Star Wars Celebration 1 had not even occurred yet. That didn't happen until April of that year. And so at this point, everybody at work was just sick of hearing me talk about how I was going to Denver for Star Wars Celebration. And, 99 was a good year. Good year.
I just imagine you, sitting at work or whatever, just being like, it's the final countdown.
We had a whiteboard, and people started writing messages about how they couldn't wait until, in quotes, the Jedi went to Denver.
That's really
and it was,
funny.
Yeah,
That's
it was
awesome.
good. It was a good time. It was a good time.
Yeah, it was. I just think of how much things have changed because, these days we don't have to stand in line or camp out for 3 months to see a movie because, just reserve our tickets online 3 months earlier with our seat. So, it's pretty awesome.
Yeah, that's kind of a mind bender in and of itself, isn't it? I slept on a sidewalk for Phantom Menace tickets. But when we get closer to the actual 20th anniversary, we'll revisit that part of it.
Well, so on the thing we're going to talk about this week, and something we were kind of batting around back and forth, behind the scenes, I guess on the other side of, the Jedi Temple, we were thinking of, in the garden. That's where we like to spend our time.
Yes.
We were thinking about what are some... Just the Phantom Menace kind of opened up, a whole new world of Star Wars in the sense that there was so much in it that, we hadn't seen before. George really expands his universe. And I wanted to know from you what you thought was the most consequential thing that the Phantom Menace added to the Star Wars galaxy that therefore kind of changed your perspective on the Star Wars galaxy.
The Jedi themselves. I think that anybody who says that they expected the Jedi to be the way that they were is not being honest with themselves, because that was an absolute mind bender. We had all grown up with that line from Yoda: adventure, excitement, a Jedi craves not these things. And I think that really formed in our collective minds, and also, of course, all the expanded universe literature and conjecture and stuff like that had formed in our minds this idea that every Jedi Master was like Yoda, off living alone somewhere. And, we didn't understand the exact mechanics of it, but it was more of a shock to the system to encounter the Jedi in the state that they were. And I know that for me, that was one of the most challenging aspects of the Phantom Menace, was because I had a very calcified, set in stone notion of how the Jedi were, and they did not match that in the film. And it was odd, and it was disorienting, but it was a pleasurable sort of disorienting because we, of course, got Qui-Gon Jinn, the shining example of, the ideal Jedi nature in many ways. And so for me, I will always answer that question with, it was the Jedi. That was the biggest change for me.
That's fascinating to me because I don't know. I don't think I was surprised with the Jedi. And I think part of that was, by the time Phantom Menace had come out, I had been reading the EU for a really long time, and many of the things that Luke and those Jedi were doing seemed familiar. I just wasn't super shocked that it looked the way it did personally.
Really?
Yeah.
Because I'd read the EU up to a certain point. I don't know if I had completely left, but I had sort of left. No, you know what? I probably had. No, it would have been after this, but I think the starting moments of my divorce from the expanded universe had started. The relationship had soured enough, and the Phantom Menace actually probably had a lot to do with my continued leaving of the expanded universe, because I found what was on screen infinitely more interesting than what was being offered on those pages. Through no fault of the authors or anything, but it was just the way that it was. So, I mean, I'd gone through the Jedi Academy trilogy and all of those sorts of things, but nothing about that felt as authentic as what I encountered in The Phantom Menace. And those were still stories that were very much centered on Luke still acting like journeyman hero, if you will, as opposed to sort of like settled, knight or Jedi master, the way that Qui-Gon expressed it. And I don't know if in the EU they'd even broached the idea of Jedi Council by that point. I don't think so.
Yeah, I can't remember. I don't remember being, super surprised about the Jedi per se. I do remember, and like you though, I do think that it opened up this whole new idea just of what the Jedi were. I mean, we had heard them talk about the Jedi before. We'd heard the explanations from Obi-Wan about how, there've been 10,000 Jedi Knights, and I think that's the thing that excited me the most. And yeah, it does really kind of change the galaxy when you see there being so many Jedi Knights, except for just, 2. And I think, that does a huge change when there is a council and they've got a temple and, there are more than just a few people that, have laser swords. Like, there's thousands of them that do, and so just getting that opportunity to really dive into that and George opening up the world in that way and giving us that opportunity was really cool. I think the only thing that maybe surprises me a little bit about the Jedi at that point was just their connection with the Senate and that relationship.
Yeah,
that's the point that definitely. So yeah, I think was something I don't know if I don't even know if I knew what to expect, honestly, with the Phantom Menace. Really, because it's hard to remember what my expectations were 20 years ago, but I just remember that being something that seeing the way the Jedi were, that was a huge game changer in the sense that we didn't really know until that point. And so it wasn't like shocking to me. It was just like, oh, I wanted more by the end of the movie.
But
I wanted more.
But it was still a seismic shift from from the collective perception of how the Jedi operated. Even having, Yoda had the statement, no, he is too old, but then encountering Anakin and then having them say that at 9 going on 10, he's too old. That was wait, what? That's too old? That sort of thing. Because the whole intricacies of how the Jedi operated, like you said, the connection to the government, but also the fact that they were so rigid about, acceptance into the order. That's a major shift from what people perceived. And so that, that's really maybe shocking is a strong word, but at the same time, it was not. I mean, I know that in my mind and in the minds of a great number of people that I knew at the time, that was a substantial shift from expectation, I guess is what I'm saying. And so, just the fact of that and the mechanics of it, or the fact that the Jedi Order had such a, I guess, finally realized sense of mechanics. I don't think that anybody had put in quite as much thought as Lucas did about what went into it and what, and how it operated and stuff like that. And speaking of how it operated, I since you mentioned the Jedi, seeing the workings of the Senate was an unexpected thing. And it also was a very different sort of thing to see that in action, because we'd never seen an actual government in action up to that point.
Yeah, I do. I think probably one of the biggest shifts was the fact that this was going to be highly political. Like, we were going to be dealing with the political system. And so I really appreciate that fact. And it was interesting to see that the beginnings of that fall here. That the little seeds have been planted that we're going to slowly build up towards this thing that's going to happen, which this republic will not last by the time we get through with this series, and so watching all the petty squabbling and all the stuff that's happening or whatever, I was like, it's sad how more relevant the movie is now than it used to be. Our government is just about as effectual as this one.
That is a fair statement, but it's also endlessly interesting, because I think that accompanying that is, we all knew, before the dark times, before the Empire, and I think that everybody, not intellectually but emotionally, didn't expect the Empire to rise out of the good system. It was almost like, I think, there was an emotional expectation that there was going to be some sort of violent coup or something like that. And so also, I think that the Phantom Menace defied expectations of, or demanded, I should say, patience from the audience that it wasn't expecting to be asked, right? Everybody wanted Revenge of the Sith. And Lucas instead gave us the Phantom Menace. And I still think that, obviously was the right choice and everything like that. But I do think that played as well into a lot of the reaction, so some of the negative reaction that was, people think that there were, if you think, I'm sure we have members of the audience who are of various age ranges, but I was very active on the internet even back then. And I can tell you that if you think that the Last Jedi reactions were vitriolic, boy, you should have tuned in for some of the stuff that was written online. It's just not as many people could read it, back then. And I think that part of that is, even The Simpsons made a joke at the expense of the Phantom Menace and the politics.
Yeah, that was something that was everywhere. And, I think one of the biggest things about the Phantom Menace, it just one of the biggest, most surprising seismic changes it creates was that it shattered everyone's expectations in the fandom for the most part. I think anybody who came into the movie thinking they knew what was going to happen, George turned that on its head. And, I talk about subverting expectations. George Lucas did it first. He subverted everybody's expectations by, by having Anakin Skywalker be a 9-year-old who seems to be a pretty good kid, but you can also see the shades of what's going to cause him to fall too in the end. And just nobody expected that, And so I think that's the thing that, really just caused that uproar that we got online at that point was people's thought process for 20 years not being met, the expectations they'd built up in their mind for so long not being met. And so I think that was one of the biggest seismic shifts that the Phantom Menace ends up causing.
I think that probably the biggest, and it took time for me to sort of synthesize it as well, but midichlorians, that is definitely not what anybody's perception of the Jedi had anything to do with. And it was, I remember at the time, that was one of the biggest points, aside from Jar Jar, but we'll talk about the movie as a whole or whatever. We're just talking about, sort of like biggest surprises sort of thing. But like midichlorians were a big thing. And I remember reading, and I can't remember the name of the magazine at this point, but I did in fact read about what turned out to be midichlorians in a magazine at the time. And I remember discussing it with a friend and both of us saying, that doesn't sound like this is how this is going to go. And then to have it wind up being true, whoever leaked that, wow, good job. But it was, what was interesting was that there was a kernel of that as early as Kevin J. Anderson's Jedi Academy trilogy, because Lando, when he was going out helping look for Jedi candidates, they found out that the Emperor had a scanner that could scan Force potential in some way. And that was, I think, our first precursor a full decade before of what would develop into midichlorians.
To me, it's midichlorians honestly just never bothered me. And part of it was just something where I think the more I thought about it, the more interesting I thought a prospect it was. Mm-hmm. And to me, it also helped explain, why do some people have a stronger Force sensitivity than others. And it also kind of, and I don't know how people would respond to this, because I feel like we kind of want to democratize this whole idea. But in the end, this symbiotic relationship between, the midichlorians and the Force and how many reside in a person, it seems to be that there's some will of the Force involved in that, and who has more midichlorians than others. And so there is some sort of destiny in the Star Wars universe in this. And so, which again kind of makes sense when I think of, where George Lucas is pulling all of his ideas from. Part of this is just the classic mythology that, we talk about with Joseph Campbell, and, you get a chosen one, you get chosen people, and therefore to create a way in which that can be understood scientifically, with machines and stuff, but also it's still such a mystery at the same time. I think, really goes to show the different ways in which, religion and science can work together, but still, the science of the Jedi doesn't completely explain all of the intricacies of, the midichlorians until we get all the way to the Clone Wars in that last, arc with Yoda, where we finally get some idea of the deep, unabiding mysteries of what it means for this to be the way it is. And I don't know, it was always something that to me just seemed to open up more cool doors than to make it something that like I should poo-poo on.
Yeah, but the thing is, it's still radically different. We're talking about how the Jedi are different from the way people perceive them, and seeing the Senate in action and the way, the seeds of the Empire and everything, these are all essentially shocks to the system. I think that if we had one less shock to the system in Phantom Menace, the reaction is a little more subdued, but it was basically shock after shock after shock. The Jedi weren't what we expected. The Senate and the politics weren't what we expected. And then the midichlorians fundamentally challenged a notion of the Jedi that had been, inculcated rightly or wrongly in the fans for decades. And, like you, I don't have a problem with the midichlorians, but there's no doubt that it was a departure.
Well,
and it was.
I don't think it's.
But it is a departure, though, because
but it's not a departure from anything other than our own expectations at that point.
Sure, but it's still. But I mean, like we're talking about, things that were surprises or shocks or what have you, and of course that plays a role in it because. It was a fundamentally different understanding of things than people had up to that point. And, things do.
Right. But, I mean, it's also a fundamentally different understanding than people had based on nothing other than speculation.
Well, I mean, the thing is, in the original trilogy, it didn't go into detail like that. The Force is an energy field that's created by all living things. It surrounds us, penetrates us, binds the galaxy together. And you have that. And then Yoda says essentially the same thing in Empire. And so it does as much sense as it makes, as much as, I remember reading an interview with Lucas in, I believe it was Starlog. And I think that magazine folded some time ago. But they asked him specifically about it. And I remember him saying exactly, what we're saying here, which is, well, there's got to be some mechanism for things to, and it was the first in print explanation, but it was definitely something that he was challenged on a lot in terms of, people still, with the sequel trilogy, there were people that were, vocally saying they didn't want to hear any talk of midichlorians or anything like that. It's still, as much as you and I would say that, most fans are at a good place with it now. There are still people who don't really dig on the concept. And, so it was a bold choice and an unexpected one.
Yeah, I guess there's just a part of me that really rebels against the idea that George Lucas changed anything, because the aspect of we didn't know because it wasn't something that was explained in the other movies, and it wasn't needed for the other movies because of, where those stories are and all of that. And so, I get that many fans felt that way, but I don't know necessarily if, I just get annoyed with it. It's just not a legitimate complaint to me about the movie.
But I can completely understand people's reaction. I may not agree with it. I may not think it's right. And I may, I actually love the concept of the midichlorians. It's actually, because we know that a lot of Buddhist philosophy influence, and if you do go to that Clone Wars arc, there is this whole idea in Buddhist philosophy of there was just energy and then it tasted matter and then being happened, and it's a very similar sort of thing. And what would determine whether somebody was stronger in the Force? Would it be something you were born with? And it is the mechanics by which they can bring the prophecy into into the story without it just being, oh, he's the child of the prophecy. Well, what do you have to say that? Midichlorians. It makes a story, a story structure sense. So I obviously agree with you. And I'm saying it was still a surprise as much as I was.
I'm not saying it's not a surprise at all. Obviously I think, it's just as surprised as anybody else that George decided to go in that way. I guess, and I'll just be honest, at that point, I don't think I had put an absolute ton of thought into, the deep mysteries of the Force, the way that I have, now. I don't know if that's a sad statement or not. But, I think part of that was, for me, watching the original trilogy, and everything, I just accepted everything for what it was, and I wasn't trying to probe the deep mysteries of the Force at that point. And so when we got to the Phantom Menace and George starts to kind of expound on those things, for me personally, it's a surprise that it goes that way, but it's not as though it's a surprise in a way that makes me mad or frustrated or, any of the other reactions that lots of other people had because they felt like George betrayed them, when it's no, he didn't betray anything. He just continued telling his story, and you didn't like the way he told his story because it wasn't what you had come up with in your head, which was based off of your own speculation. So, I don't know. I was never in that camp, so it was hard for me to place myself there. And we've talked about before, I'm somebody who's much more willing to accept a creator's ideas than my own ideas, more readily than I think a lot of people. So I'm weird like that.
Well, that aside, it's still a question of surprise, the different things that he brings in that are surprises to the audience, especially this audience that's been there for a long time. They still remain unexpected. And, I think it's beautiful that they're unexpected. I'm a champion of movies that move in unexpected fashion. And
they just move in mysterious ways, like you do.
Right. Yes. but it really is something as well where, like, we have had at least one discussion on midichlorians by this point, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
We have along the way. Especially
going over to the Nerd Party.
Yeah.
Yeah, go to the nerdparty.com and you can hear us talk on several episodes about the midichlorians. But I mean, it does tie into the concept of duality that goes through the entire film. But
and I think the way that it, and this was the thing, I think one of the surprises for me is the way that George begins this thesis in The Phantom Menace, which is about symbiosis, and that we are all in a symbiotic relationship. And the moment that we begin to think of ourselves more than we ought, we change that symbiotic relationship and we break it. And, the best way to kind of describe that in many ways was the midichlorians and their intimate symbiotic relationship with the Force that then allows people to tune into the Force. And it always kind of made me wonder, were there people then who maybe had a higher, midichlorian count, but really never knew it, but they never really listened either, So there's this whole idea of like, what it means to be a Jedi and listening and stillness and all those things. And of course, then you have the major themes of symbiotic relationships throughout the galaxy itself. And that's where all the politics come in. And so it's like in every step of the way, George is kind of using that theme. And it's a theme that's going to play out through the next two movies as well, as that symbiotic relationship is clearly broken in every single area of the Star Wars galaxy. And, people always said, oh, well, he never really follows up on that. Well, it's like, that's exactly what he does in the next two movies. It just is a continual breakdown of symbiotic relationships with nobody caring that that's actually happening until it's too late. And so I think that's the thing that I was kind of surprised in, that he kind of went in that direction. Because, he uses that in many different places, some of them for comedic effects, whether it's, there's always a bigger fish, to, the more deeper levels that we get with, learning about midichlorians or the way in which governments are corrupted and that ruins the relationships there. So I don't know. That's something that I don't know. I think the thing that was most surprising for me is I wasn't necessarily ready for Star Wars to be this deep, honestly. Like, as much as I love the original trilogy, George is really diving in deep here, and he'll continue to do that through the rest of this prequel trilogy in a way that he didn't do in the first trilogy. So that's something I wasn't necessarily expecting at all.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's definitely, there was a shift from a more emotional sort of storytelling to now a more intellectual sort of thing. And with the symbiont circle, Obi-Wan specifically calls out the symbiont circle between the Naboo and the Gungans. And so, that whole, it's right there in the script, you form a symbiont circle. And so this, to your point, the duality, the symbiont circles, those sorts of things definitely come into play through the entire thing. But I mean, I just found everything to be, I mean, the movie I just thought is full of surprises when you first come at it, especially when you came at it in May of '99. And the one thing I wasn't surprised at, because, we've been sitting here talking about surprises and subverting expectations and stuff. The one thing I was not surprised at was Darth Maul's death. That was the thing that I knew was going to. I knew that Qui-Gon was going to die, not because of the soundtrack, but because of the trailer. And so Darth Maul's death didn't then really take me by surprise because of I just figured he had to go. But Qui-Gon's death definitely didn't take me by surprise because, and I could drag him up, but I remember my friend Mike at the time, we saw the trailer and it shows Obi-Wan, shouting, "No!" And I looked at him, I said, "Qui-Gon dies." He said, No, they're not going to, he's going to make it through I was like, no, that only happens when somebody dies in Star Wars. Trust me, he's done. So it's, that was the one not surprise. Was there anything in this that was a particular not surprise for you?
I wasn't surprised about how awesome it looked.
Yeah.
After the trailers, I expected the movie to look this great, and it did not disappoint, and I think, I realized it was going to look amazing. So that wasn't surprising. But what was surprising in lieu of that was the fact that I didn't know that the universe was going to be so big. The Phantom Menace just kind of blew my expectations as to what the Star Wars galaxy was, because it had been very small before, and now it just felt enormous. And that was something I think that not only did it subvert my expectations and blow them away, but then it just set me up for the joy of what was to come and what could be in the Star Wars galaxy. And I think, if there's any expectation that blew my mind, was just that this can be so much more than I thought it could be. And that was a neat thing. That Star Wars can be more than I thought it could be. And that's a good place to be when you're in a franchise, that it opens your mind to, as that other franchise would say, possibilities.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point, because when you see that Senate chamber and you see all of the seats, that was really cool. That was really, really cool. Because to your point, it's like, look at all of the stories that are out there that could be told. Like, just because they had said, in different source materials and stuff like that, that the Empire was 1,000 worlds. But it's hard to sort of like get your head around that, especially when you're a kid. And then to see it on screen like that, it's like, oh, wow, this is even more major than I imagined. But I agree. It is such a beautifully shot movie. And I really wish that David Tattersall got more credit for the fact that he balanced. Hey, there's that balance again. But the fact that he managed to shoot and light the movie in such a way that those digital effects could be worked in pretty much as seamlessly as they were is a real testament to everything. And I think that I think that the Phantom Menace is a movie that continues, every time I've revisited it, it continues to surprise me. But surprise me in the sense that I think that, especially at the time, and I saw Phantom Menace in the theater a lot of times, but it felt like trying to, grab onto sand. Like it almost felt like it was slipping away before you could really get a hold of it, because that there was that very vocal fan base that reacted so negatively to it. It was so difficult to stay in that moment and continue enjoying it because of, I remember there was a guy who waited in line for the movie, and you know what? Let's go ahead and add on. The surprise was another surprise was how vitriolic people were with their reaction to it. That was a surprise, because I remember the guy who waited in line with us to buy tickets, who came out of the first showing, PISS, and the guy then was at another one of my later showings that I saw like a couple of days later, and he was walking into the theater griping about it. And I remember sitting there saying, "Oh, why does this guy have to be in there?" And it wasn't until years later that I really sort of pieced together that he was comic book guy from The Simpsons. You know, I've registered my displeasure with this movie, and that is why I'm only going to see it 8 more times. It's like, dude, just walk away. Just walk away. It's fine. It's fine.
Yeah, that is something that I think, one of the legacies of the Phantom Menace became an awful legacy, which was the internet finally gave rise to a place where people could say the worst, nastiest, most awful things on the planet anonymously and get away with it, and it started to become okay. And so the way that
thank you, Ain't It Cool News.
Yeah. Well, and it became okay for the way that, people like George Lucas were treated, Jake Lloyd were treated, Ahmed Best was treated. I mean, these people's lives were irreparably harmed by people on the internet. I mean, Ahmed Best has talked about it on Twitter, and on his vlog on YouTube, talking about how there was a point where he very much considered suicide. There is a real dark side to what happened with the Phantom Menace, and we still haven't really learned the lesson, and that's really sad. One of the things that's overjoyed me is watching more and more people kind of come around to the prequel trilogy as it's gotten older. And so, I it's one of the things I'm really appreciative of. And, I'm very glad that somebody like Ahmed Best has spoken out about what happened to him, and that we're starting to listen to those kind of things. And so, in the end, though, I think the thing I love the most about the Phantom Menace is that it brought Star Wars back. And it led to amazing things. We'll get to the Jedi, Revenge of the Sith, the fights there. We'll see amazing things in Attack of the Clones. We'll get the Clone Wars. I mean, there's just so much that comes from this one thing, from, as the documentary called it, the beginning. And, I really appreciate this beginning. And I'm like you. I really enjoy rewatching The Phantom Menace. And each time I find something else that I hadn't seen or hadn't thought of, or, it's just a fun movie, gosh, 20 years ago, I just cannot believe it.
Yeah, 20 years is a long time. And it's been a long time since this, like you said, it forms the bedrock of so much else to come. This is the foundation on which the rest of the house was built, and it's a pretty darn good foundation. But if anybody wants to debate the finer aspects of that foundation with you, Matt, where can they find you?
Yeah, I am Matt Rushing02 all over the place. Twitter, Instagram, Tumblr, and Letterboxd, all over to that same name. You can find me here on the network doing Owl Post with Dre Kaufman, talking about Harry Potter. You can find me on Owl Post with Drea Kaufman, talking about Harry Potter each and every week. We do one chapter at a time. You can also find me over on the Trek FM network doing a couple shows. One is called The Orb with Chris Jones about Star Trek Deep Space Nine. We are hoping to be back very soon, so take a look for that. And then you can find me on the 602 Club with my co-host Christy, as each week we talk about something else in the geek world. Every franchise we can kind of fit in on that show we talk about. And then last but not least, also coming back for the new year is Cinema Stories with my good friend Courtney, where we talk about films through the lens of faith. But John, if anybody wants to talk about maybe their favorite memories from the Phantom Menace, or the things that really stuck out to them, where can they find you?
Well, just look for Kessel Junkie, KESSELJUNKIE. I hang out on Twitter. You can also find me on Letterboxd and Goodreads. You can find me here on the network as part of a very fun ongoing project looking back at the year 1994, week by week, with Mike Schindler on a show called Retro Perspective. You can find me co-hosting Words with Nerds with my pal Craig, and you can also find me, occasionally writing pieces for a site called Set the Tape, it's a lot of fun. Just got to review Speed Kills with John Travolta, and that happened. That happened. But all of that said, Matt, I think there's only one thing left to say. I think it's time to close negotiations.
John, negotiations are closed.
Join the revolution. Join the Nerd Party.